On that particular morning, before the sun had fully burned away the coastal fog that clung to the parking lot like a reluctant guest, the sounds arrived in layers. A school bus exhaled its brakes somewhere beyond the entrance gates. Children's voices rose and fell in that particular frequency. It belongs only to field trips, not quite excitement, not quite chaos, but something caught between the two. A vibration that carried across pavement and through glass and into the underground viewing corridors where the water pressed against thick acrylic walls. A teacher called out a name, then another. The roll call drifted like scattered paper in wind. Somewhere closer, inside the main building, an elderly man cleared his throat. It was a small sound, private, the kind of sound a person makes when they are preparing to stand for a long time, or when they are remembering something that sits heavy in the chest. He stood near the railing that overlooked the lower viewing deck, his hands folded over the metal bar, his eyes not yet focused on anything in particular. From the cafe near the gift shop, a coffee machine hissed. A toddler laughed, then stopped abruptly, distracted by something shiny on the floor. And then, beneath all of it, beneath the bus brakes and the children and the throat clearing and the coffee machine, there was the low, pressurized silence of the tank. The water moved, or seemed to move, though from above it appeared still as poured glass. The morning light came through the skylights in tail columns, touching the surface without penetrating it. She was already there. The whale had been there long before the first bus arrived, long before the elderly man took his position at the railing, long before the cafe opened or the parking attendants pulled on their orange vests. She moved in circles that had no beginning and no end, her body displacing thousands of gallons with each slow rotation, her pectoral fins held slightly away from her sides as if she were perpetually about to embrace something she could never quite reach. When the first group of children pressed their faces to the underwater viewing window, she was already passing. The glass bent the light in such a way that she appeared even larger than she was, and she was already impossibly large, her body stretching longer than the school bus that had brought them, her eye alone the size of a dinner plate. One child, a boy no older than 7, pressed both palms flat against the acrylic. His mouth opened, his chest stopped moving. For 3 full seconds, he did not breathe. The bleachers filled slowly, the way all bleachers fill, with shuffling and excuse-me's and the scraping of bag straps against aluminum seating. The school groups came in waves. First the elementary children with their matching t-shirts and their harried teachers counting heads, then the middle schoolers who tried very hard to look unimpressed, then the occasional high school group that moved with the self-conscious awareness of being too old for this and not old enough to admit they still wanted to see. The older visitors sat near the edges. They did not come in groups. They came alone, or in pairs, and they chose their seats with the careful deliberation of people who had been here before. One woman, her hair gray at the temples, carried a small thermos and a paperback book she would not read. A man in his 60s wore a baseball cap that had faded from navy to something closer to gray, and he sat with his elbows on his knees, watching the water with the patience of someone who had learned that patience was the only currency the whale accepted. A camera flash went off despite the signs. A teacher said something sharp and quick. The child lowered the camera. At the center of the stadium, the surface of the pool reflected the white canopy above. The water was still, the crowd was not. Bags rustled. Thermoses opened and closed. A child asked how long until it started, and a parent said soon, which was the only answer anyone ever gave to that question. The whale surfaced. She rose without urgency, her blowhole breaking the water with a sound like a great sigh, to mist catching the light and dispersing before it could settle on anything. For a moment, she rested there, her dorsal fin small and curved, with a distinctive notch near the base visible above the waterline. She did not look at the crowd, she did not perform. She simply existed in that narrow space between water and air, breathing because breathing was what she had always done. And then she slipped below again, her fluke rising and falling with the economy of motion that belonged to creatures who had measured their lives in nautical miles. The crowd applauded. The whale did not acknowledge the sound. She had known this sound her entire captive life. It came in waves, like tides that did not correspond to any moon. Sometimes it was loud, a wall of noise that pressed against the water's surface and made the trainer's hand signals harder to interpret. Sometimes it was sparse, scattered clapping from a half-empty stadium on a rainy Tuesday in November. The sound changed with the seasons, it changed with the years. New generations of voices replaced the old, the pitch shifting almost imperceptibly as the children grew up and were replaced by children who were not yet born when she had first arrived. But beneath all the variations, the sound was always the same. Palms striking palms, the universal language of expectation. She had learned, in ways that no trainer had taught her, to measure time by that sound. The high seasons brought thunder crowds packed so tight that the bleachers creak, the applause so sustained that it became a single, unbroken roar. The low seasons brought silence interrupted only by occasional bursts of enthusiasm from school groups who did not know the difference between a Thursday in February and a Saturday in July. She knew the difference. She knew, too, that the applause always came at the wrong moments. It came when she surfaced, it came when she dove. It came when she opened her mouth for a fish reward. It came before the behaviors were finished, during the behaviors, after the behaviors. The humans clapped because clapping was what they did, not because they understood what they were seeing. She swam her circle regardless. In the third row from the front, slightly to the left of center, a child sat with her hands in her lap. She was perhaps 8 years old, though it was hard to tell with children they grew at odd rates, their faces changing year to year in ways that made age a guess best. She wore the same yellow t-shirt as the other children in her group, the same lanyard with a name tag that had been filled out in careful block letters by someone other than herself. Her sneakers had been white once and were now gray with playground use. She sat between two other girls who had already begun to whisper to each other, their shoulders touching, their giggles suppressed but not invisible. She did not join them. When the whale surfaced, the child in the third row did not stand. When the crowd applauded, she did not lift her hands. She sat very still, her eyes fixed on the water, her lips slightly parted, her breathing shallow and quick like a small animal that had sensed something larger moving nearby. The teacher in charge of her group noticed eventually. She leaned down and whispered something, probably sit up, probably pay attention, probably something about respecting the presentation, and the child nodded without hearing, her gaze never leaving the tank. The whale passed below the surface. The crowd's attention shifted to the far end of the pool, where a trainer had appeared with a bucket and a whistle. Signals were given. Behaviors were performed. Fish were delivered, swallowed, forgotten. But the child did not watch the trainer. She watched the space where the whale had been. She watched the water settle back into stillness. She watched, and she did not applaud. And when the whale finally returned to that spot, passing through it, as she passed through every other spot in the tank, because the tank was her entire world and she had no choice but to pass through all of it, eventually the child leaned forward. Her lips moved. She might have been saying something, or she might have been mouthing a word she did not know how to speak, or she might have been exhaling in a way that only looked like speech. No one was close enough to hear. The whale's eye passed by the glass, vast and dark and older than the child could imagine. And for a long moment, neither of them moved at all. The afternoon show was scheduled for 2:15. By 2:10, the stadium had settled into the particular hush that preceded all performances, not silence, but a lowering of volume, a collective intake of breath. The trainers were in position, the whistles were ready. The buckets were full, the crowd waited. The whale did not appear. She was there, of course. She had nowhere else to be, but she had settled near the bottom of the main pool, her body suspended in the cold blue, her flukes barely moving. The trainers gave the signal for the opening behavior, a simple surfacing, a slow glide past the viewing platform, and she did not respond. They gave it again. The underwater speakers transmitted the tone that had accompanied that behavior for as long as she could remember. She did not move. A trainer adjusted his position, another reached for her backup whistle, as if the problem were a matter of equipment. The stadium manager spoke quietly into his radio, the words inaudible to the crowd, but visible in the way his shoulders tightened. In the bleachers, the silence stretched. Someone coughed. A child asked, in a voice not quite low enough, why she wasn't doing anything. A parent shushed a child. A different child, emboldened, asked the same question louder. A different parent gave a different answer. She's resting. She's shy. She come out soon. Just wait. And the explanation hung in the air, thin and unconvincing. The whale remained at the bottom. Time moved strangely in that stadium. Seconds became minutes. The trainers conferred in hushed tones. Someone made a decision. The show would be abbreviated. The whale would not be forced. The backup behaviors, the ones that did not require her direct participation, would fill the remaining time. A gate opened at the far end of the tank. Smaller shapes emerged. Dolphins, trained to leap and spin, their bodies sleek and urgent in ways the whale's was not. The crowd redirected its attention. The applause resumed, scattered at first, then building. Children pointed, parents lifted cameras. The moment passed. But in the third row, the child with the still hands had not looked away from the place where the whale hovered, suspended in that deep blue stillness, refusing something that could not be named. When the applause finally came, it came late. The dolphins had finished their sequence. The trainers had bowed. The announcement had been made: "Thank you for visiting. Please exit to the right. The gift shop will remain open until 6." And the crowd had begun the slow, shuffling process of leaving. But somewhere in the nose, someone began to clap. Not for the dolphins, not for the trainers. Someone clapped for the whale, who had done nothing, who had refused to perform, who was still visible beneath the surface if you knew where to look. It was a single pair of hands at first, then another, then a small cluster near the back, elderly visitors mostly, people who had been coming long enough to remember when the whale was new, when her dorsal fin had not yet begun to curve, when the tank had seemed large enough. The applause grew uneven, uncertain. It did not swell into the full-throated roar that accompanied the leaps and spins. It was something quieter, something that felt almost like apology. The trainers exchanged glances. The stadium manager spoke into his radio again, this time with less tension and more confusion. A child's voice cut through. "She didn't even do anything," a teacher responded, quick and automatic. "Shh, sit down. We're leaving." "But she didn't. I said sit down." The whale rose slowly, her body tilting toward the surface with the patience of continents shifting. She broke through just long enough to breathe one long exhale, one long inhale, and then she slipped below again, her fluke barely visible, her movement unhurried. The strange applause faded. The stadium emptied. The sun moved across the skylights, shifting the shadows on the water's surface. And in the echo of that afternoon, someone said not loud, not to anyone in particular, "That wasn't in the program." No one answered. The years passed the way years pass in places that resist change, slowly on the surface, relentlessly beneath. The sounds shifted. The school buses that had once coughed diesel now hummed with quieter engines. The cameras that had once flashed now captured silently, their screens glowing like small blue windows in the darkness of the viewing corridors. The children's voices remained constant in pitch, but changed in vocabulary: new slang, new references, new ways of expressing the same ancient astonishments. The whale remained. She swam her circles. She surfaced when she surfaced. She ate when she was fed and rested when she could rest, and responded to the signals that she had learned so long ago, that they had become something deeper than training, something closer to reflex, something that lived in her body even when her mind had drifted elsewhere. The trainers changed. Some retired. Some moved to other facilities. Some left the industry entirely, their reasons spoken quietly in break rooms and never repeated to the public. New trainers arrived, younger and eager, their techniques updated by research that tried to account for things that could not be quantified: boredom, loneliness, the particular weight of living in a space that could be crossed in seconds. The tank did not change. It could not change. The dimensions were fixed. The depth was the depth. The walls were the walls. Engineers came occasionally to inspect the filtration systems, the viewing windows, the structural integrity of concrete that had been poured before some of the trainers were born. They took measurements. They wrote reports. They recommended modifications that would require budgets that did not exist. And all the while, the whale swam. She passed the same viewing window 6 times an hour. She saw the same blue-green light filtering down from the same skylights at the same angle depending on the season. She felt the same pressure changes when the gates opened and closed, the same vibrations when the crowds filled the stadium, the same silence when the facility closed and the lights dimmed, and she was left alone with the hum of the filtration system and the sound of her own breathing. Time, for her, was not a line. It was a circle. A decade later, or perhaps was 15 years or 20. The records were inconsistent and the memories of regulars were unreliable. Another child sat in the third row. This one was a boy, perhaps 10 years old, wearing a t-shirt from a school in a different district, and the one from all those years ago. His hair was shorter, his sneakers were a different brand, His posture was different in the subtle ways that posture always differs from person to person. But he sat with his hands in his lap. He did not clap when the others clapped. He watched the water with an intensity that seemed too large for his body. Beside him, an elderly woman sat quietly. She was not his grandmother. The school group records would later show that she had no connection to the boy at all. She was simply a visitor, one of the regulars who came every Tuesday because Tuesday was quiet and the light was go, and the whales seemed calmer on Tuesdays, though that last part was probably projection. The woman watched the boy watching the water. She recognized something in his stillness, though she could not have explained what it was. She had seen it before. She had seen it in herself. Decades ago, when she had been young enough to sit in bleachers without her knees aching, when the whale had been young enough that no one yet worried about how long she would last. The presentation began. The trainers gave their signals. The whale performed some behaviors and refused others, as she always did now, her reliability eroded by something that looked like stubbornness, but might have been something else entirely: exhaustion, perhaps, or a kind of patience that humans mistook for defiance. When the whale surfaced near the viewing platform, the boy leaned forward. His breath caught. His chest stopped moving. For 3 full seconds, or perhaps it was 4 or 5, the elderly woman was not counting. He did not breathe. His eyes were wide, his lips parted, his entire body frozen in that particular stillness that comes only when the mind has encountered something too large to process and must simply shut down the peripheral systems to cope. The whale's eye passed by, and then the boy exhaled, a shuddering release of air that was louder than it should have been, loud enough that the children beside him turned to stare, loud enough that the elderly woman instinctively reached out, not quite touching him but close enough to catch him if he fell. He did not fall. He sat back in his seat. He blinked several times, rapidly, as if clearing water from his eyes though there was no water. And then, very quietly, so quietly that only the woman beside him could hear, he said, "She's so big." The woman nodded. "I know," she said. And neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else to say. The decline came slowly, the way all declines come slowly when you are watching closely and too fast when you look away. It was the little things first. The movements became less fluid, more deliberate. The circles widened, then narrowed, then widened again in patterns that did not match any previous patterns. The trainers noticed before the public did. They were paid to notice, trained to notice, and yet even they could not agree on what they were seeing. "She's just tired," one said. "She's adjusting," said another. "She's..." And here the third trainer paused, looking for a word that would not alarm anyone. "Processing." The veterinary staff increased their monitoring. Blood draws became more frequent. The reports grew thicker, denser with jargon and qualifications and careful phrasings designed to convey information without conveying panic. The tank temperature was adjusted. The feeding schedule was modified. Supplements were added to the fish buckets, vitamins and minerals and other things that were meant to support systems that were beginning, perhaps, to struggle. The crowds did not notice at first. They came the same as they always came, with their cameras and their expectations and their applause. They watched the behaviors and they bought the merchandise and they left satisfied that they had seen what they had come to see. The whale performed. The whale surfaced. The whale was there, but the regulars noticed. The elderly man with the faded baseball cap noticed that she no longer approached the viewing window as often. The woman with the thermos and the unread paperback noticed that her breathing seemed heavier, the exhalations more labored. The handful of visitors who came week after week, year after year, who had watched her since she had first arrived, they noticed the way she listed slightly to one side now, the way her dorsal fin had begun to curl more sharply, the way she sometimes paused in the middle of a circle as if she had forgotten why she was swimming. They did not speak of it to each other. They did not form committees or write letters or organize themselves into any kind of collective action. They simply watched and remembered and carried their observations with them like small weights in their pockets. The sounds changed. The applause grew quieter, not because fewer people came, but because the people who came seemed less inclined to make noise. Parents shushed their children more quickly. Tour guides spoke in lower tones. Even the school groups, normally the loudest visitors, seemed subdued, as if the tank itself had become a place that demanded reverence. No one announced this change. No one decreed that the volume must lower. It simply happened, the way weather happens, the way seasons change, the way all living things respond to proximity to something ancient and tired. On the morning of the last full day, the stadium was nearly empty. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, the kind of day when the coastal fog never quite burns off and the parking lot remains half empty until closing. A school group had cancelled at the last minute, something about a bus breakdown, or a scheduling conflict, or perhaps simply a change of heart by a teacher who had read the news reports and decided that this was not the right time to bring children to see a whale who had become a symbol of something complicated. The regulars were there, of course. They were always there on Tuesdays. The elderly man sat in his usual spot, his cap pulled low against the gray light that filtered through the skylights. The woman with the thermos, older now, her hair more gray than it had been, her hands less steady, sat 3 rows behind him, in the seat she had claimed as her own decades ago. A handful of others scattered themselves throughout the bleachers, a young mother with a sleeping infant strapped to her chest, a middle-aged man in a business suit who had clearly taken a long lunch, a pair of teenagers who might have been skipping school, or might have been homeschooled, or might have been simply lost. They did not speak to each other. They did not need to. The whale surfaced at 10:47 a.m. She rose slower than usual, her body breaking the surface with a lethargy that was visible from every angle. Her blowhole opened. The exhale was audible to audible, rattling slightly in a way that made the trainers exchange glances. She inhaled. She slipped below. The circle continued. At noon, the presentation was scheduled to begin. The trainers took their positions. The music played, the same music that had played for years, slightly tinny now from speakers that had not been updated in a generation. The announcements were made. The crowd was welcomed. That the whale did not respond to the opening signal. She did not surface when commanded. She did not swim to the platform. She remained in the middle of the tank, suspended at a depth that made her visible, but unreachable, her body casting a shadow on the pale blue bottom. The trainers waited. The crowd waited. The music faded. And in the silence that followed, someone began to clap. It was the elderly man. His hands moved slowly. The sound soft and irregular, not the sharp percussion of enthusiasm, but something gentler, acknowledgement, perhaps, or farewell. He clapped the way one might clap at the end of something that was not a performance, something that was simply ending because all things end. The woman with the thermos joined him, then the young mother, one hand on her sleeping child. Then the teenagers, uncertain but willing. The sound did not swell, it did not build to a crescendo. It remained small and scattered and sincere, a handful of people in a half-empty stadium offering the only thing they had to offer, the sound of their palms meeting, over and over. For a creature who had heard that sound 10,000 times and had never once understood why they made it, the whale surfaced. She rose slowly, her body angled toward the bleachers in a way that might have been coincidence and might have been something else. Her eye vast, dark, still carrying whatever mysteries she had carried all her life, passed across the scattered crowd. She exhaled. The mist caught the gray light and dissolved into nothing. And then she slipped below, and did not rise again. The water remained still for a long time after. The trainers entered the medical pool through the gate that had always been there, hidden from public view by the careful architecture of the facility. They moved quickly, but without running, their training overriding whatever else they might have been feeling. The veterinary staff followed. Announcements were made. Please accept calmly. The presentation has been concluded. We thank you for your understanding. And the crowd dispersed with the quiet obedience of people who had sensed something significant and did not wish to interfere. The elderly man remained in his seat. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the surface of the water, his breathing slow and even. The woman with the thermos rose, then paused, then sat back down. The teenagers drifted toward the exit, looking over their shoulders, unsure whether they had witnessed something ordinary or something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The sun shifted behind the fog. The skylights grew brighter, then dimmer, then brighter again. In the viewing corridor below, empty now, the lights dimmed to half power. The gift shop closed thoroughly without explanation. The acrylic window looked out onto a tank that was no longer occupied in the way it had been occupied for so many years. The water moved. The filtration system hummed. A maintenance worker passed through, checking gauges, noting readings, performing the tasks that would need to be performed regardless of what had happened or what would happen next. He paused at the main window. He was young, perhaps 25, new enough to the job that he had not yet learned to stop looking. He pressed one hand against the acrylic cool beneath his palm. The same temperature had always been, and he watched the empty water for a long time. Somewhere above him, in the stadium that would not reopen until the following spring, a single balloon drifted against the canopy. It had been released by a child hours earlier, before the morning fog had lifted, before the regulars had taken their seats, before the whale had surfaced for the last time. It bumped against the white fabric, trapped and silent, a small red circle against a pale expanse. No one came to retrieve it. In the months that followed, the facility issued statements. They were careful statements, drafted by professionals who understood the weight of words in public discourse. They spoke of legacy and education and the complicated history of marine mammal care. They did not apologize because apology implied wrongdoing, and wrongdoing implied liability, and liability implied a cascade of consequences that no one was prepared to manage. They thanked the public for their years of support. They announced plans for renovations that would transform the space into something new, an interactive exhibit, perhaps, or a memorial of some kind, or simply a reimagined architecture that would serve a different purpose. The regulars did not read the statements. The elderly man stopped coming to the facility entirely. He was seen sometimes at the pier, sitting on a bench that overlooked the ocean, his faded baseball cap pulled low against the salt wind. He never said what he was looking for in the water. He never said whether he found it. The woman with the thermos donated her paperback books to the local library. She took up birdwatching instead, training her binoculars on creatures that could fly wherever they wished, that could cross oceans without permission, that could disappear into the horizon and never return if that was what they chose. The teenagers graduated. They moved to other cities. They forgot, and then remembered, and then forgot again. The school children who had passed through over the years, the ones who had pressed their faces to the glass, the ones who had clapped without knowing why, the ones who had forgotten to breathe, and the whale swam too close, they grew up. They became parents themselves. They brought their own children to aquariums in other cities, and sometimes, in the viewing corridors, they paused without knowing why. Their children asked them what they were looking at. They did not have an answer. The tank was drained on a Thursday in early spring. It took longer than anyone expected. The volume of water, accumulated over decades, required careful disposal, and the sediment at the bottom had to be tested and treated and transported according to regulations that had not existed when the tank was first filled. Workers in rubber boots waded through the shallows, collecting debris, coins that visitors had thrown over the railings despite the signs, fragments of equipment that had been dropped and never retrieved, a single child's shoe that no one could explain. The walls, exposed to air for the first time in a generation, revealed their history. Algae stains marked the waterlines of different eras. Scratches in the paint corresponded to unknown events, collisions, perhaps, or moments of distress that had never been recorded in the official logs. The viewing windows, seen from inside for the first time, were cloudy with age, their acrylic surfaces scratched by years of pressing palms and camera lenses and the slow accumulation of salt and time. One worker found something scratched into the painted wall near the bottom of the tank. It was a date, just numbers, no context, and below the date, a single word that might have been a name or might have been something else entirely. The worker photographed it with his phone, intending to share it with someone, but by the time his shift ended he had forgotten, and the photograph was lost in the endless scroll of images that accumulate in devices and are never viewed again. The tank was filled with concrete. It was cheaper than removal, the engineers explained. More structurally sound. The space above would become a plaza, open to the sky, with benches and planters and a small informational display that would explain, in carefully worded text, what had once existed here and why it no longer did. No mention was made of the whale. The display spoke of marine education and changing standards and ongoing commitments to conservation. It included photographs of the ocean, the real ocean, vast and wild and empty of the barriers that had defined the whale's existence, and it invited visitors to support efforts to protect the creatures that still swam free. The benches faced the sea. On clear days, from the right angle, you could see the horizon. You could watch the water move without walls. You could imagine, if you were inclined to imagine such things, what it might have been like to swim without circles, to dive without rising, to exist in a space that had no edges. The visitors who came to the plaza did not stay long. They took photographs, they read the display. They sat on the benches and felt the wind and watched the gulls wheel overhead. And then they left, because there was nothing to see, because the thing that had been worth seeing was gone, because memory is a poor substitute for presence, and presence had become, in the end, the only thing the whale had ever offered. Years passed, the plaza weathered, the benches faded. The informational display was updated once, then twice, then allowed to deteriorate as budgets shifted and priorities changed. The gulls continued to wheel, the ocean continued to move, the sun rose and set and rose again, indifferent to the stories that humans told about the spaces they occupy. Sometimes, in the viewing corridor that had been sealed but not demolished, too expensive to remove, the engineers had explained, easier to simply close the doors and let it become part of the foundation. The lights flickered. It was a wiring issue, probably old systems, poorly maintained, responding to humidity and salt, and the slow decay that claims all things built near the water. The maintenance staff noted it in their logs and moved on to more pressing concerns. But sometimes, late in the evening, when the plaza was empty and the facility was closed, and the only sounds were the waves and the wind and the distant hum of the city, a security guard would pause in his rounds. He would stand at the edge of the old stadium, now plaza, now memorial, now space that served no purpose except to mark the absence of what had been. He would listen, and sometimes, not often, not predictably, not in any way that could be documented or explained, he would hear something. A sound like breathing, a sound like water moving in a space too small to contain it. A sound like applause, distant and scattered, coming from nowhere and everywhere, echoing off walls that no longer existed. He never mentioned it to anyone. He did not believe in ghosts, and he did not believe in memories that outlived the beings who made them. He believed in wiring issues and humidity and the tricks that tired minds play on themselves in the small hours, but he always paused, he always listened. And he always walked away with the sense that something had been here once, something vast and patient and impossibly large, something that had watched and waited and finally, after all those years, simply stopped. The last person to speak of the whale directly was a child. She was the granddaughter of the woman with the thermos, now passed, her paperback books distributed among relatives who did not read them. The child was 8 years old enough to understand stories, young enough to believe them, and she sat on her grandmother's couch, sorting through photographs that had been stored in a shoebox in a closet that had not been opened in years. Most of the photographs were of people, weddings, graduations, holidays, the ordinary milestones that accumulate over a lifetime. But near the bottom of the box, beneath layers of aging paper and fading ink, there was a single photograph of water. Just water, blue-green, shot through with light, the surface visible as a faint ripple in the upper corner. There was no whale in the photograph, there was no stadium, no crowd, no trainers or buckets or signals. There was only the water, captured in a moment that must have seemed worth capturing, preserved in a box that must have seemed worth preserving, passed down through generations until it reached a child who did not know what she was looking at. She held the photograph up to the light. "What is this?" she asked. Her mother, sorting through papers on the other side of the room, glanced over. "I don't know," she said. "Just water, I think. But why did Grandma keep it?" Her mother paused. She crossed the room and took the photograph, turning it over to look for writing on the back. There was none. She turned it over again, studying the image as if it might reveal its own history. "I don't know," she said again. The child took the photograph back. She looked at it for a long time, longer than a child usually looks at anything, longer than the image seemed to warrant. The water shimmered in the fading afternoon light, the surface rippled, the blue-green depths held whatever they held, silent and impenetrable. "It looks like something was there," the child said. "Where?" "In the water, like something big. You can almost see the shadow." Her mother looked again. She saw nothing but water. She saw nothing but light and color and the vague suggestions that all photographs make, the half-truths of frozen moments. But the child saw something. She saw it the way children see things, without proof, without logic, without the careful qualifications that adults use to protect themselves from believing too much. She saw a shadow in the water, and she knew without knowing how she knew that the shadow had been vast and patient and alive. She kept the photograph. She tucked it into the pages of a book, and she carried the book from house to house. She grew up, and she never quite forgot the shadow, even as she forgot the details of her grandmother's life, even as she forgot the shoebox and the couch and the afternoon light that had made the water shimmer. And sometimes, years later, when she found herself near the ocean at a pier, or a beach, or a ferry terminal, anywhere the water stretched to the horizon, she would pause, she would listen, she would hear the waves, and the whine, and the distant sounds of people living their lives. And beneath all of it, she would hear something else. A sound like breathing, a sound like applause, a sound like a child forgetting to breathe, just for a moment, before something too large to understand. The whale is gone now, the tank is gone, the stadium is gone. The bleachers and the buckets and the whistles are gone. The trainers have moved on, and the regulars have passed away, and the school children have become grandparents themselves. But the sound remains, it echoes in places that have been demolished. It lingers in photographs that show nothing. It lives in the pauses between words, in the held breaths of children who have never seen a whale, in the silence that falls over rooms when someone tries to explain something too large for language. The whale swam in circles for decades. She watched generations pass through the bleachers. She heard thousands of hours of applause, millions of palms striking palms, an ocean of sound that meant nothing and everything. And in the end, she simply stopped, not in protest, not in surrender, not in any way that could be explained or excused or transformed into narrative. She stopped because stopping was what came next, because every circle eventually closes, because even patience has a final moment. She did not ask to be remembered. She did not ask to be mourned. She did not ask for anything at all, because asking was not something she had ever learned to do, because asking implies hope, and hope implies a future that might be different from the past. She only asked, in the silent language of her body, to be seen. And she was seen by the child who forgot to breathe. She was seen by the elderly man with the faded cap. She was seen by the regulars and the school groups and the trainers who came and went and came again. She was seen by the maintenance workers and the security guards and the visitors who paused at the viewing window and did not know why they felt the way they felt. She was seen. And that was something. Perhaps it was enough. The water moves differently now. In the ocean, the real ocean, the one she never knew, whales still swim. They dive to depths that no tank could accommodate. They surface in waters that stretch to every horizon. They sing songs that travel for miles, vibrating through the blue in patterns that humans have recorded but never understood. They do not know about the whale in the tank. They do not know about the bleachers or the applause or the child in the third row who did not clap. They do not know about the circles or the signals or the slow decline that everyone saw coming and no one could stop. They do not carry her memory, because memory is a human burden. And whales in the wild carry only what the ocean gives them, the cold, the dark, the vast and indifferent beauty of a world that does not ask to be understood. But sometimes, not often, not predictably, not in any way that science has documented, a whale will pause. She will surface in waters far from any shore. She will rest there, her body still, her eyes scanning the horizon for something that is not there. She will exhale, and the mist will catch the light, and for a moment she will seem to wait, as if listening, as if remembering, as if somewhere, across miles and years, and the uncrossable distance between the captive and the free, a sound is still echoing. Palms striking palms, the collective breath of a crowd. A child forgetting to breathe, and a whale, patient beyond all patience, waiting to be seen.